Hey guys, I'm John Setzler. Welcome back to Atlanta Grill Company. Today we're going to do the Boston butt video. We're going to teach you everything you ever wanted to know about cooking a Boston butt. I'm going to show you how I do mine. We're going to take the mystery out of it and we're going to cover everything. So let's get started. The first stage in getting our Boston butt ready to cook is to trim and season the meat. And what I have here is an 8.5 pound Boston butt. And what we can see here is what's called the fat cap. I'm fortunate that this one doesn't have a very thick fat cap on it. If yours has a thicker fat cap, you want to trim this side down to where the fat cap's no thicker than about 1/4 of an inch. And then the next thing you want to do is season the meat. And I like to use a barbecue rub. Like today I'm using my Man Cave Meals AP Mojo. And I'm going to give this guy a very liberal coat. I want to put enough rub on here to where you can't see the meat through the rub. And I'm going to get this covered on all sides, which is give it a nice tight wrap in plastic. And I'm going to put this back in the refrigerator overnight. This is optional. You don't have to do this. I like to do it because it allows the salt to go to work on the meat a little quicker. I think it gives me a little better flavor, but once again, this is fully optional. I've gone ahead and unwrapped this Boston butt. I've had it seasoned and wrapped in the refrigerator for about 18 hours or so. And when you unwrap yours, if you decide to do this, you can feel free to add more rub to it if you like. I'm going to leave this one just as is, and I'm getting the Kamado Joe fired up, and then we're going to put this guy on to cook. I've got the Kamado Joe Classic 3 fired up here. We're rolling right along at 300 degrees Fahrenheit. I've got the slow roller in, and I've got some cherry and pecan wood in there to make some smoke. So we're going to set this Boston butt right in the middle of the grill. I'm going to close it up and we're going to let this guy go until we get the bark formed, which in this case is going to take roughly 4 hours based on my experience at this temperature. So we're going to close this guy up and we'll come back in about 4 hours when the bark is ready, and then we'll move on to the next step. And then we'll just start my timer counting, so we'll know how long this guy's been cooking. We've been cruising along here for about 2.5 hours now, and this thing's looking really good. The bark is not where we want it yet. It's not passing what's called the scratch test, which means you don't want to be able to scratch it off with your fingernail. So these usually take about 4 hours or so to get to that point at 300 degrees, so we're going to close it up and keep right on cooking. We've been going 4.5 hours now, and I'm pretty happy with what that looks like. This bark looks good on here. So we're going to move on to the next step. I'm going to pull this off the grill and I'm going to wrap it tightly in foil, and then we're going to bring it right back. Okay, I've got this guy wrapped up, so we're going to toss it right back on the grill, and I'm going to throw a temperature probe in here just so I can monitor it without having to unwrap it, to know about when we're going to come back to go to the next stage. I'm going to let this guy get up to probably about 200 degrees internally before we look at it again. We are just about 6 hours into this cook at this point, and my internal meat probe's reading about 200 degrees. I don't know exactly how accurate that is because I don't know if we're right in the middle, but what I'm going to do is we're going to open this back up. I'm going to pull that meat probe out, and we are going to open up our foil. And the first thing I want to do is check this for probe tenderness. And what I mean by probe tenderness is my temperature probe from my Thermapen sliding in here with little to no resistance. It's very probe tender out here on the end. It's a little tight right here in the middle. So I'm going to let this stay on for another 20 minutes or so. But what I'm going to do is I'm not going to wrap it back up. I'm going to leave it open where that bark can dry out a little bit from being in the foil. So we'll come back and have a look at this again in about 20 minutes. Okay, we're at 6 hours and 20 minutes, and I think we're about ready. I just checked this thing a minute ago, and I believe I'm as tender as I'm going to be right here in the middle. This guy's looking really nice and probe tender. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to take this guy off, and we're going to wrap it up in foil again. And now that I've got it double wrapped in foil, I'm going to drop it right down inside of my Yeti and toss a towel on top of it. Close this guy up, and I like to let it rest for a minimum of an hour, but in this case, I'm going to let it go for at least 2 hours. Alright, I've let this rest for 2 hours, or maybe 2 hours and a half. In our cooler, I've taken it out of the foil, and we'll just yank that bone out of there. That's what you're looking for. When you know you've got a great cook, when that bone will pull out like that. And this thing's still steaming hot, so you can see from there how well this thing stays hot in the cooler. Have a look at that meat. You know, it just falls apart. And we're just going to take it. I just like to get my hands in here and pull this guy apart. You can have a look there. Got a nice little smoke ring going in this meat. So we just grab it, and I like to just kind of mash it up with my hands. Different people like to pull their pork different ways. You can pull it with a fork. You can get something like the meat rakes and pull the meat apart. I just like to kind of roughly pull mine apart by hand. I like mine kind of stringy, and this looks really good. So what I do is, if I'm not serving this immediately, is I put it all in a Ziploc bag and let it cool in the refrigerator, and then I vacuum seal it and just toss it in the freezer. So guys, that's all there is to a Boston butt cook. This is real simple. This method I've shown you is very simple, and at 300 degrees it doesn't take all day. So I'm going to go ahead and package this up, and then I'm going to come back, and then we're going to talk about the entire process and different ways you can handle it. So the steps that you have to go through when you want to make pulled pork are not very difficult. The first thing you have to do is select a piece of meat. You can buy your Boston butt bone in or boneless. I prefer bone in on mine. It doesn't really help anything, but the meat hasn't been butchered by somebody else. Sometimes they make a mess of it cutting the bones out, so I buy bone in. I like to buy Boston butts that weigh between 8 and 9 pounds. Those just seem to work best for me as far as taste, texture, cooking time, everything. I don't go much bigger than that, and I also try to avoid smaller than that. So you pick the meat out, then the next step you have to do is prep your meat. And like you see in this video, I went ahead and seasoned mine the day before I was going to cook it. That's optional. You don't have to do that. I like to salt my meat ahead of time, especially when I'm cooking a big piece of meat, and let that salt get into the meat and penetrate it. It's kind of like a dry brine process, but once again, that's optional. But I showed you how to do that, so that's something that can all be done in advance. And when you prep that meat also, you have to look at that fat cap on the Boston butt. If it's thick, you want to trim some of it off. If it's thin like mine, you can just leave it alone. But I've had Boston butts before that have had a 1/2 inch or better fat cap on it. You want to trim that down a little bit, because that's not going to render off very well. So you buy your meat, you prep it, which can include pre-seasoning or whatever. Then it's time to go to the grill. I cooked mine at 300 degrees, and the reason I choose 300 degrees for my Boston butts is because I can get one done in the course of a regular day. I can put it on in the morning and serve it that evening if I want to. I'm not looking at extended cook times that you would have otherwise. But that's not to say you have to do it that way. If you want to cook yours at 225, feel free. 250. I have cooked Boston butts at every temperature between 190 and 400 degrees, and it's all edible. There are some differences you have to pay attention to when you get into temperatures above 300 degrees. If you want to cook hotter than 300, you have to pay attention to the rub you're going to use. If it's got sugar in it, a lot of sugar will caramelize at 330 degrees, I believe it is, and it will scorch and become hard and brittle. You don't want that. So if you're going to cook at temperatures above 300, I would recommend using a sugar-free rub. So pick what cooking temperature you're going to cook at. If you want to cook at 225 or 250, you're going to be looking at close to 2 hours per pound of cooking time. Some people will tell you you'll get it in an hour and a half. Some butts you might get them that quick, but a lot of them are going to take 2 hours per pound. And that one I just did, we're talking about 16 plus hours of cook time to get that one cooked if I want to cook at 225. But feel free to do that. Sometimes I cook at lower temperatures, like if I want to cook one overnight and I want to extend my cook for some reason, I'll cook it at a lower temperature. But as far as taste and texture in the finished product, I don't see a whole lot of difference at all between something cooked at 225 and something cooked up to about 325. When you start going above 325, your bark's going to be a little bit tougher. The outer surface of the meat's going to be a little bit tougher. And there's some things you can do to remedy that. You can see that once my bark set on this Boston butt, then I wrapped it up. That speeds the cook along. That helps cook a little quicker once you put the wrap on, because you're basically steaming at that point. And also, that's optional. You don't have to wrap it. You can leave it unwrapped and let it cook right on the grill unwrapped until it's done. You'll get a firmer bark that way, and you'll get a thicker bark that way in most cases. But it's purely preference. You can do whichever you want, and I encourage you to try it both ways. So pick your cooking temperature, and if you're a beginner at this, I would recommend making some notes. You want to get a feel for how long it's going to take to cook at certain temperatures, and it won't always be exactly the same. When you plan your cook based on a time and temperature, you need to give yourself probably 2 hours, give or take, on the leeway, because you'll get 2 8-pound butts, and if you cook them at 250, one of them might be done in 14 hours and the other one might be done in 17 hours. It just depends on that particular cut of meat and how the fat and moisture is distributed inside of it. So you'll get the hang of how long it takes, and you'll find your groove. And I also encourage you to try it like I've done here at 300 degrees, because I think that's a really good temperature. So pick your temperature, decide whether or not you want to wrap it. Don't wrap it until your bark's nice and solid, because if you do, that bark will disintegrate in the wrap if it hasn't formed completely. And there's no set temperature of the internal meat that bark's going to form. Some people are going to tell you, I wrap at 160 or I wrap at 165. I wrap mine when the bark's set, and that can happen anywhere between about, in my experience, 165 and 175. Sometimes they take a little longer. If you're cooking at a lower temperature, it does take a little longer to get that bark to set. The higher temperatures help the bark set a little quicker. So play with it. Get some experience. Look for that probe tenderness. That's how you're going to know when the meat is ready. That's one of the big stumbling blocks of learning to cook the big barbecue meats, is knowing when it's ready. So if you don't know what probe tender feels like, get a jar of peanut butter and get your instant read thermometer and push that probe into that jar of peanut butter. There's very little resistance there, and that's about what it should feel like when you put that temperature probe into your Boston butt. Everywhere on the Boston butt. It'll get probe tender on the outer edges before it does in the middle, but it needs to be probe tender all over before that thing's ready. And when you get to that point, it's time to take it off, double wrap it in foil and let it rest in a cooler for at least an hour. I like to go for at least 2, but you can go up to 4 or 5. So there's a lot of play room there. So Learn what probe tender feels like and shoot for that. Some folks are going to tell you, I pull mine off when the internal temperature is 202 or 203. That's fine, but it might not be ready. If you pull it off too soon and don't have that probe tenderness all over the butt, it's not going to get probe tender. The carryover cooking that you have on these things, especially when you're cooking at lower temperatures, is minimal. You won't get a 10-degree carryover if you're cooking at 225 like you might if you were cooking something else at 350. The higher temperature you're cooking at, the more carryover you're going to get. So that's something to pay attention to as well. And if you are a beginner at this and don't have a lot of experience with it, one of the things you're going to want to avoid in the beginning is trying to do too much. Keep it simple like we did here. Don't do it. Don't worry about injecting. Don't worry about, any kind of advanced technique. Everybody's going to tell you when you ask them, they've got some little trick they do, and you're going to start collecting these tricks in your mind, and you're going to say, I'm going to try all of that. Well, the problem with that is some of it may work, some of it may not, but if you run into a problem, you're not going to know which trick caused the problem. So start out simple and evolve your technique as you go. Change one thing at a time. Once you master this simple technique, then do something different the next time around. Try something different that one of your buddies is doing and see if you can tell the difference, but don't overdo it in the beginning. So this is how you cook a Boston butt. This is how you get it done simply, and get it done deliciously. Until next time, this is John Setzel with Atlanta Grill Company.